October 26, 2005. Early morning. Tu Dao Mot Cemetery, Binh Duong Province, southern Vietnam. A woman is brought out from a death row cell. Her hands are tied. Guards hold her by each arm. She is 48 years old, but her face looks worn, aged beyond her years. As they walk her toward the execution ground, she begins to resist. She curses at the guards, struggles against their grip, tries to dig her heels into the pavement. She is told that her petition for clemency has been rejected by the president. When she hears this, her anger collapses into tears. She refuses the last meal offered to her. Then she makes one final request: to remove the blindfold, to see the world one more time. The sky, the trees, the faces of people around her. The request is denied. Her name is Lê Thanh Vân. To neighbors, she was a soft-spoken woman who presented herself as a dentist. To the Vietnamese justice system, she is something else. The country's first formally prosecuted female serial killer, a woman responsible for at least 13 confirmed murders. The media called her the Cyanide Witch. How did an ordinary woman from a poor Saigon family become one of Vietnam's most notorious poisoners? How did she kill so many people without being caught for years? And what drove her to turn trust, food, and drink into instruments of death? This is her story. Lê Thanh Vân was born on December 5, 1956, in Saigon, then the capital of South Vietnam. Her father worked in drainage systems. Her mother was a midwife. Van was the second of 8 children in a working-class family struggling to make ends meet. When her older brother died, Van suddenly became the eldest surviving child. Responsibility for helping raise her younger siblings fell on her shoulders. But according to relatives, she was not a nurturing older sister. She was described as cold, aggressive, and quick to anger. Family members later recalled that she had a disturbing habit. She would beat household animals without apparent reason. While other children played, Van seemed emotionally detached, indifferent to the suffering of living things around her. No formal psychiatric diagnosis was ever recorded, but those who knew her as a child remembered her as fundamentally different from other children. Van attended school up to the 12th grade, but never completed her education. In 1975, she enrolled in a military medical dental school. There, she received basic training in dental care and medical terminology. She never became a licensed professional, but she learned just enough to sound convincing when she later impersonated doctors and dentists. Her criminal record began early. Not long after entering the dental school, Van was arrested for attempting to illegally cross the Vietnamese border. She was sent to a re-education camp and held there for about 16 months. After her release, she returned to Ho Chi Minh City. In December 1979, police in the 10th District arrested her again, this time for impersonating an army captain. She had been using a fake military identity to gain privileges and respect. She was sentenced to several months in prison. In March 1990, she was arrested once more, this time in the 5th District, for document forgery and theft. She received an 18-month sentence. By the early 1990s, Van had spent years in and out of detention. She had no stable profession, no legitimate credentials, and no honest source of income. Instead, she lived by lying, forging documents, and manipulating people into trusting her. The foundation for what would come next was already in place. In 1984, Van married a man named Nguyen Quang Mei. They had 2 children together. For a few years, it appeared that Van might settle into a normal domestic life. But in 1989, her husband died suddenly. The cause of death was never clearly established. No autopsy focused on poisoning, no investigation followed. Around 1991, Van remarried. Her second husband was a man named Lê Thanh Vân. Just 1 year after their wedding, he died in Nguyen Tri Puong Hospital. Once again, the circumstances were vague. Once again, no one suspected foul play. Only years later, after Van's arrest, would investigators look back at these two deaths with suspicion. They would add them to a list of possible murders tied to her, but without preserved tissue samples or toxicology reports, proving anything was impossible. Then came a case that should have been a turning point. On October 24, 1992, Van was working as a live-in caregiver for a family in Ho Chi Minh City. The head of the household was a man named Chung. One day, Van cooked chicken noodle soup for the entire family. Shortly after eating, everyone in the house became violently ill. They were rushed to the hospital. Chung's wife, a woman named Bui, died. The others survived, but barely. An autopsy was performed at Cho Ray Hospital. The doctors concluded that Bui had died in a state of severe intoxication, but they could not identify a specific poison. The surviving family members accused Van directly. They told police that she had deliberately poisoned the food. But the evidence was not strong enough. Van was not charged with murder. Instead, she was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 4 years in prison. This was a critical failure of the justice system. A woman had died after eating food prepared by Van. The family had accused her, yet she walked away with only a fraud conviction. By the mid-1990s, Van was released. 2 husbands were dead. A woman in a household where she worked was dead. Multiple people had been hospitalized after eating food she prepared, and still no one had connected the pattern. In late 1997, Van found work at Military Hospital 7A in Ho Chi Minh City. There, she met a man named Din Van Kam, who had come to visit a relative in the hospital. Van approached him with confidence. She introduced herself as a qualified dentist who had studied abroad in Germany and spoke 7 languages. None of this was true, but Van delivered the lie with such conviction that Kam believed her completely. Impressed by her apparent credentials, Kam offered her a job. His family ran a dental clinic in the town of Long Can, and they needed staff. Van accepted immediately. It was a fresh start, a new community, and most importantly, a new pool of potential victims. In Long Can, Van met another man connected to the clinic, Diu Dan Quang. They began a relationship, and soon after, they married. This was Van's 3rd marriage. Unlike her first 2 husbands, Quang would not die mysteriously. Instead, he would become something far more dangerous, a witness, a silent accomplice, and eventually a co-defendant. Quang knew things, he saw things, and when people around Van started dying, he said nothing. Whether out of fear, complicity, or denial, he stood by while his wife killed. By early 1998, Van had embedded herself deeply into the life of Kam's clinic and family. She had access to people's homes, their trust, and their food, and soon that access would turn deadly. January 3, 1998, the first officially confirmed murder. The victim was an elderly woman named Vo Thi Lee, the mother of Din Van Kam, the man who had hired Van to work at the clinic. Lai was 60 years old. At the time, there were tensions within the clinic. Business was struggling. Quang, Van's husband, was at risk of losing his position. Lai had been involved in discussions about the clinic's future, and she had expressed opinions that affected Quang's standing. One day, When Calm was away, Van prepared a glass of fresh lemonade and brought it to Lai. The drink looked normal, refreshing, harmless. But Van had added cyanide to it. Within 30 minutes, Lai lost consciousness. Van and Quang rushed her to the hospital. Doctors tried to save her, but she died. On the way back from the hospital, Van went through Lai's belongings and took approximately 900,000 Vietnamese dong in cash, along with personal items. The death was recorded as a medical emergency. No one suspected murder. Van had just learned how easy it was to kill and walk away. 5 months later, on June 2, 1998, another man died. His name was Quoc Cam Min. He was a security guard for the Thien Phu Company in Tan Binh District. Min had rented Van a room where she could run her dental practice. He charged her 500,000 dong per month. One day, Van invited Min to have a drink with her. She offered him alcohol. He accepted, but the drink had been poisoned. Shortly after drinking, Min became violently ill. He was taken to the Tan Binh Medical Center, where he died. While doctors were treating him, Van went to his home and stole around 900,000 dong. Again, the death was attributed to sudden illness. Again, no one suspected the woman who had been with him just before he collapsed. In July 1998, Van killed again. This time, the victim was even closer to home. Hin Van Dinh, the mother of her husband Quang. In other words, her own mother-in-law. Van prepared tea for the older woman and added cyanide to it. After drinking the tea, Hin fell ill and died. Following her death, Van gained access to approximately 2.8 million dong from family finances and inheritance. Van had now killed her employer's mother and her own husband's mother, and still no pattern was visible to authorities. On February 24, 1999, another family member died. Le Van Cam was Quang's brother, Van's brother-in-law. He had injured his finger and asked Van for help with treatment. She gave him what she said was medicine, but she had mixed the medicine with cyanide. By the end of the day, Cam was dead in Gia Dinh People's Hospital. At this point, Van had killed 4 people in just over a year. All of them were connected to the clinic or to her husband's family. All of them had died after consuming something Van had given them, and all of them had been written off as natural or medical deaths. But Van was not finished. In fact, she was just getting started. There was also the case of a woman named Ho Thi Mong Dao. Van approached her, claiming to be a professional dentist, and offered to perform a medical examination. On the way to the supposed clinic, they stopped at a roadside noodle shop. While Dao was distracted, Van added cyanide to her bowl of noodles. Dao ate the food and soon became seriously ill. She was rushed to Mat Than Hospital in Ho Chi Minh City. Doctors managed to stabilize her. She was treated and discharged the same evening. Van offered to take care of her at home. The hospital agreed. That night, Van poisoned Dao again. This time, there was no hospital to save her. Dao died. Van had poisoned the same woman twice. The first attempt had failed, so she simply tried again. For her, killing was not an emotional act. It was a task to be completed. Another victim in 1999 was a man named Vo Hu Kiem, a company director. Van poisoned him for one simple reason. She wanted his motorbike. A human life, to her, was worth whatever property she could steal from it. By 2000, Van was no longer limiting herself to people connected to the clinic or her family. She began moving across provinces, using false identities and targeting strangers. Using the fake name Li Li Lan, Van was hired by a man named Nguyen Than Son, who lived in the small town of An Linh in Binh Duong province. She presented herself as a caregiver and medical helper. On April 14, 2000, Son ate rice vermicelli prepared by Van. Shortly afterward, he became seriously ill. His condition deteriorated over the following days. Eventually, he died. The death was recorded as a prolonged illness. No one suspected poison. In late June 2000, 2 more people died, Nguyen Van Dong and Tran Thi Sin, both acquaintances of Van. After Sin's death, Van wrote a handwritten letter to Sin's relatives. In the letter, she claimed that Sin had recently sold her a car for approximately 200 million dong. This was a lie. Van was attempting to legitimize her possession of Sin's property by creating a false paper trail. By this point, police in several provinces were beginning to notice a pattern. Multiple sudden deaths, all connected in some way to the same woman. In the summer of 2000, Van was arrested. When police searched her bag, they found approximately 2.8 grams of cyanide. This should have been the end of her killing spree. The poison was in her possession. The bodies were piling up. The connection was clear. But the Vietnamese forensic system in 2000 was not equipped to handle this kind of case. Toxicology labs lacked the advanced equipment necessary to definitively detect cyanide in decomposed tissue. When investigators ran tests on the seized poison and compared it to traces found in victims' organs, the results were inconclusive. Without hard scientific proof linking the cyanide in Van's bag to the deaths, prosecutors could not charge her with murder. Instead, they charged her with fraud and illegal possession of poison. On January 15, 2001, Lê Thanh Vân was released on bail. It was a catastrophic mistake. Within weeks, she would kill again. March 2001, Van encountered an old friend named Nguyen Chung Du. He was happy to see her. He offered to give her a ride on his motorbike and suggested they stop at a cafe to catch up. They sat down and ordered bottles of soy milk. While Du stepped away to fix something on his motorbike, Van quietly added cyanide to his drink. Du returned, drank the soy milk, and within 15 minutes he felt sick. He was taken to a local hospital. 5 hours later, he was dead. The official cause of death? Stroke. Van took his money and mobile phone. She even attempted to inflate the funeral expenses, hoping Du's son would reimburse her later. When that scheme failed, she pawned Du's motorbike for 2.8 million dong. Around the same time, Van poisoned a woman named Dao Thi Ko. Van had tried to convince Ko that she was a legitimate dentist with real credentials. Ko didn't believe her. That skepticism cost Ko her life. Between June and August 2001, Van killed 2 more people. The first was a man named Tran Van Coy. Van poisoned him to steal his motorbike. The second was a woman named V. Thi Than. Than owned a clothing shop and a plot of land in the Bu Dong area. Van poisoned Than, then used Coy's stolen motorbike to transport her to the hospital, where she died. Using yet another fake name, Lam An Dao, Van then took control of Than's shop and sold her land for approximately 40 million dong. This was Van's most brazen theft yet, not just money, but an entire business and property, and it would prove to be her downfall. By this point, investigators from multiple provinces were quietly tracking her movements. They knew they didn't have enough evidence to charge her with murder, but they couldn't let her continue. On October 15, 2001, Lê Thanh Vân was arrested again, this time in the village of Duc Lieu. She was charged with illegal possession of poison. It was a legal maneuver to keep her off the streets while investigators built their case. This time, she would not be released. To understand how Van killed so many people without being caught, You need to understand her weapon, cyanide. Cyanide is not like other poisons. It doesn't burn. It doesn't have a strong taste or smell in small doses. It dissolves easily in water and alcohol, and it kills quickly. When cyanide enters the body, it attacks cells at the most fundamental level. It binds to an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria, the powerhouses of cells. This prevents cells from using oxygen even if the victim is breathing normally. The result is a kind of internal suffocation. The body shuts down. Symptoms appear rapidly: dizziness, nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing, confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness, and finally, cardiac arrest. A lethal dose can be as small as 0.15 to 2 grams, depending on the form of cyanide and the route of exposure. Van's victims consumed cyanide in drinks or food, which meant the poison took effect within minutes to half an hour. All 13 of Van's confirmed victims showed similar symptoms before death: sudden weakness, vomiting, and collapse. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, most Vietnamese hospitals did not have the equipment to detect cyanide poisoning. Doctors misdiagnosed the deaths as heart attacks, strokes, or pneumonia. Even when police conducted experiments on animals using Van's seized cyanide, they could not reliably detect the poison in tissues after death. This made cyanide the perfect weapon for a serial killer. It was invisible, it mimicked natural causes, and it left almost no forensic trace. Van exploited this weakness in the system for years. She was not the first serial poisoner to do so. History is full of killers who used poison precisely because it is so hard to prove. In Victorian England, a woman named Mary Ann Cotton poisoned as many as 21 people with arsenic. More recently, in 2024, a woman in Thailand named Sararat Rangsiwuthaporn, known as Cyanide, was convicted of killing 14 people with cyanide for financial gain. Like Van, she targeted people she knew, offered them food or drink, and walked away with their money. Poison is often called the weapon of women, though this is more myth than reality. What is true is that poisoners tend to kill for money, not passion. They are methodical, patient, and calculating, and Van fit that profile perfectly. By mid-2002, senior investigators from Ho Chi Minh City, Binh Duong, Binh Phuoc, and Dong Nai provinces held a joint meeting. Each region had unsolved deaths. Each had weak evidence. But when they compared notes, a pattern emerged. In case after case, one name appeared: Lê Thanh Vân. She was present when victims fell ill. She offered them food or drink. She was nearby when they died. And afterward, money or property went missing. The investigators decided to merge their cases into one large, coordinated investigation. They also turned their attention to Van's husband, Dieu Dan Quang. He had been with Van during some of the incidents. He had helped transport at least one victim to the hospital. He knew more than he was saying. On August 14, 2002, Quang was arrested and charged with failing to report serious crimes. Later, prosecutors would accuse him of being an accomplice in at least one murder. Meanwhile, Van refused to cooperate. She avoided questioning, claimed illness, and did everything she could to slow down the investigation. Some victims' bodies, like that of Tran Van Coy, had never been found or properly examined. Witnesses were scarce. Evidence was circumstantial. On January 3, 2003, the investigation team held a critical strategy session. Instead of trying to prove all 13 murders at once, they decided to focus on one case where the evidence was strongest: the murder of V. Thi Thanh, the woman whose shop and land Van had stolen. This case had everything: financial motive, false identity, property transfers, and a clear timeline. Van was moved to a new detention facility. After weeks of focused interrogation, she finally broke. In February 2003, she confessed to killing Than. Once the first confession came out, the rest followed. One by one, Van described the murders, who the victims were, how she poisoned them, what she stole, and where she went afterward. By the time she finished, she had admitted to 13 killings. Investigators believed there were more, possibly as many as 16 to 20 victims, including her 2 earlier husbands and other suspicious deaths. But without bodies, toxicology reports, or witnesses, those cases could not be prosecuted. In total, Van admitted to stealing approximately 242 million Vietnamese dong, along with electronics, motorbikes, and other property from her victims. August 25, 2004, the trial of Lê Thanh Vân begins. The courthouse is packed. Journalists, families of victims, and curious citizens fill every seat. This is unprecedented in Vietnamese legal history, the first time the country is publicly trying someone as a serial killer. The prosecution lays out its case methodically: 13 murders by cyanide poisoning, 13 acts of robbery, illegal possession of poison, use of false identities, a pattern of behavior spanning from 1998 to 2001. Prosecutors demand the death penalty. Van, sitting in the defendant's chair, looks calm at first, but when it is her turn to speak, she changes her story completely. She claims she is innocent. She says her confessions were forced by police pressure. She insists that she was simply present when people became ill, and that she actually tried to help by taking them to hospitals. The lead prosecutor, Chow Tien Nga, asks her directly, "If you are innocent, why did you have 2.8 grams of cyanide in your bag?" Van offers an implausible explanation. She claims that a doctor friend of her father, a man named Lam Thien Truong from Dong Nai province, gave her the poison and asked her to deliver it to a forensic laboratory in Ho Chi Minh City. Prosecutor Nga presses her, "Why would a provincial police department need you, a non-professional, to transport poison to a lab? Why not use official channels?" Van has no answer. On August 28th, during the trial, Van collapses in the courtroom. The session is adjourned. 2 days later, doctors examine her and conclude that the collapse was due to psychological stress, not a serious medical condition. The trial resumes. Witnesses testify. Forensic experts present findings. Family members of victims describe how Van entered their lives, gained their trust, and then watched them die. The judges deliberate. The evidence is overwhelming. Van's own confessions, the cyanide in her possession, the financial gains, the repeated pattern, and the sheer number of deaths surrounding her. On the final day of the trial, the court delivers its verdict: guilty on all counts. Lê Thanh Vân is sentenced to death by firing squad. Her husband, Du Dan Quang, is found guilty of being an accomplice in at least one murder and is sentenced to 21 years in prison. Both Vân and Quang file appeals. On February 1, 2005, the appeals court upholds Van's death sentence. However, Quang's sentence is reduced from 21 years to 17 years. Van submits a petition for clemency to President Tran Duc Luong. It is quickly rejected. There is nothing left to stop the execution. October 26, 2005. We return to where we began, the cemetery at Thu Dau Mot. Lê Thanh Vân is led to the execution site. According to Nguyen Dung, a member of the local execution council, Van curses, resists, and then breaks down in tears when she hears that her clemency petition has been denied. She refuses her last meal. She asks to have her blindfold removed so she can see the world one final time. The sky, the faces of people, the landscape around her. The request is refused. A firing squad raises their weapons. Within seconds, the life of Vietnam's first officially recognized female serial killer comes to an end. But her legacy does not end there. For Vietnamese law enforcement, the Van case exposed critical weaknesses in the system. Toxicology laboratories were outdated. Coordination between provincial police forces was poor. Doctors were not trained to recognize poisoning, and perhaps most importantly, the public had no awareness that serial killers even existed in Vietnam. After the case, Nguyen The Binh, a senior official at the Ministry of Public Security, outlined 4 key lessons. First, the public must be cautious of strangers who offer food or drink unsolicited. Second, police must closely monitor suspects even when evidence is weak. Third, forensic capabilities must be improved with modern technology and training. Fourth, the state must enforce strict controls on the sale and possession of poisons. For criminologists, Lê Thanh Vân became a textbook case of a financially motivated serial poisoner. She did not kill out of anger or passion. She killed for money, property, and convenience. She weaponized trust, domesticity, and the social expectation that women who cook and care are nurturing, not dangerous. American criminologist Michael Farrell, in his book The Criminology of Serial Poisoners, noted that Van deliberately committed her crimes across multiple provinces, likely because she knew it would be difficult for investigators to connect the dots. Lê Thanh Vân remains the most prolific and notorious serial killer in Vietnamese history. Officially, she was convicted of 13 murders. Unofficially, the true number may never be known. Her 2 earlier husbands, who died in the late 1980s and early 1990s, were never exhumed. The woman named Bui, who died in 1992 after eating Van's chicken soup, was never counted in the final tally. And there were other suspicious deaths, other near misses, other victims who survived but were never included in the trial. If all those cases are true, Van may have killed as many as 16 to 20 people over more than a decade. The nickname, the Cyanide Witch, entered Vietnamese criminal history and remains there to this day. Her story is studied in police academies, taught in criminology courses, and remembered as a warning that evil does not always announce itself with violence or rage. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, a cup of tea, and a quiet offer to help. And by the time you realize what is happening, it is already too late.